welcome to this talk about my experience of writing about the Battle of Aughrim as fiction. The insights that has given me into what happened on that fateful day and how it has changed my perception of one of the main strands of the traditional account of the battle, the treachery of Colonel Henry Luttrell. First of all, an explanation of how I came to write about the battle and the surrounding months of 1691 as fiction, and what I think are the advantages of that approach. I grew up in the village of Aughrim, where my father, Martin Joyce, was the principal of the National School and built up a museum of artifacts found on the battlefield, which are now mainly in the Aughrim Visitor Centre. The Battle of Aughrim was his passion, and he was, to an extent, on a one-man mission to take it out of the shadow of the Battle of the Boyne, to make it better known, and to have its true significance as the decisive battle of the Williamite War recognised and appreciated. He loved nothing more than showing visitors his collection in the school and guiding around the battlefield. There were many summer Sundays when my sisters and I were young and packed into the family car to go off to the seaside at Galway, and someone who had got out for their Sunday drive earlier than we had would arrive to see the museum. We would be all unloaded. My father would disappear for the day, much to the irritation of my mother, I have to say. As children, my friends and I saw the battlefield as our playground to reenact the cowboy films, which were a staple of the Sunday night showings in St. Catherine's Hall, rather than the events of 1691. In a sense, I was neither interested nor uninterested in the battle. It was just something that was always there in the background of my earlier years. I inevitably picked up the story of what happened, but never intended to write anything about it. After he retired, my father had a vague notion of doing so, but he wisely preferred to talk about it rather than sit down to the drudgery of writing. I have discovered over the years that there is a faithful band of people who understand the significance of Aughrim, which has for the last 2 centuries or so been overshadowed by the Boyne. Interestingly, it was not always so. In the first century after the Williamite War, Aughrim and its date, July the 12th, was the focus of the victors' celebrations. Among those who have had a lifetime fascination with Aughrim is a family friend, Coleman Morrissey, who visited my father's museum as a child. Over the years, Coleman built up an unrivaled library of contemporary accounts of the battle and had an idea for a book, using this library as an invaluable research resource. Like my father, he didn't fancy the drudgery of doing the writing either. So he slowly reeled me in, as he liked to put it, and persuaded me to do it. At the time, I had just completed the 3rd in the series of historical spy novels set in Dublin during the Second World War. So it seemed natural to me to write about Aughrim in the form of fiction rather than as a factual history, of which there are several already. That quickly expanded into an account of most of 1691, because it seemed impossible to explain what happened at Aughrim without describing what had gone immediately beforehand, and to explain its significance without dealing with the aftermath culminating in the Treaty of Limerick. And so the book became an account of most of the year, and took me about 2 years to research with the help of Coleman's library and to write. There are 2 types of historical fiction, one that uses history simply as an exotic background for totally or largely fictional stories. That's a very popular genre of books and the subject of endless costume dramas beloved of television. The other uses real events and real people, often with a fictional character or 2 thrown in to help the narrative. The second form usually keeps closely to the facts insofar as we can ever know them. The modern expert at this type of historical novel is undoubtedly Hilary Mantel, the author of the Thomas Cromwell trilogy, which began with Wolf Hall. She is famous for the depth of her research, a stickler for accuracy, and has written that the novel must be as true to the facts as the writer can make them. Obviously, one has to make things up, like the dialogue, for instance, and come to conclusions about what might have been going on in people's heads based on their actions and their own and other people's accounts of the events at the time. History is hindsight, often written with one eye on the present and sometimes even on the future. Mantell defines the job of the historical novelist as lifting the burden of hindsight and putting the reader in the moment, when everything is still all to play for and nobody knows what's about to happen. Simply put, to give the reader an idea of what it might have been like on that Sunday morning in July 1691, to be standing on Kilcommodon Hill, waiting for the fog over the marshy land below to lift and for the future to make itself known. So the interesting thing about writing history as fiction is to try and put aside our knowledge of what happened and see events in real time as they unfolded. Just like us today, who have no idea really of how the future will turn out. People involved in historical events in the past had no idea what lay ahead of them. They would have had their hopes and fears, dreams and expectations and so on, but like us, had no idea how events would eventually play out. The individual soldier in a battle can have little or no sense of what is happening other than what he can see with his own eyes. Most commanders are probably equally blind to how the overall situation is progressing, except perhaps in their own immediate area. So the individual experience can be quite different to what eventually emerges as the accepted narrative of what went right or wrong and why. That narrative almost certainly includes elements of fiction, especially as time goes by and historians put a shape on it to make sense out of it. And that shape is often then frequently modified by politicians or ideologues of a later era who discard the awkward edges to mold it into a story for their own purposes. The accepted narrative of the Battle of Aughrim is that the central defining incident was the death by cannonball of the Jacobite general, the Marquis de Saint-Roux. Other factors are believed to have included the fact that one wing of the Jacobite front near Aughrim Castle had been weakened because the defences there had been diverted from two other areas where the fighting was more intense. That Saint-Roux did not tell his generals of his plans, although the immediate plan must have been obvious to everyone. What Saint-Roux intended to do after repulsing and defeating the Williamite attack was another matter. Another factor is supposed to have been that the castle ran out of ammunition, either because they had the wrong size musket balls or they simply didn't have enough. And another fatal factor was that the Jacobite cavalry in the area, under the command of Henry Luttrell, rode away when attacked, and that Luttrell literally sold the pass. Few, if any, of these events would have been evident to the vast majority of the Jacobite army as they happened, even to those on the northern section of the battlefield, beside the castle, where the outcome was finally decided. Indeed, the Williamite general Godard de Ginkle, who presumably had as much information as anybody in the immediate aftermath of the battle, did not know for certain that his opposite number had been killed. He was writing back to his political masters the following day, saying that he was still trying to confirm reports of Saint-Roux's death. Neither do we know the precise sequence of these events and their significance in leading to the route that followed. What we do know is that there was a weakness in the Jacobite lines near Aughrim Castle, which allowed the Williamite cavalry to break through and turn the tide of the battle. The reasons for it may have been Saint-Roux's accidental death. It's not credible to believe that he was deliberately targeted by a distant gunner, or that they may have been the actions of his own cavalry in riding away once he died. Also, the weakness left on that factor by the front by earlier decisions, the shortage of ammunition in the castle, or the failure of Luttrell's cavalry in that area to repulse the attacking enemy, or a combination of all of these, or more that we know nothing about. One of the interesting facts about 17th century warfare that I came across in my researches was that retreats and possible routes always began behind the front lines, which makes sense, of course, when you think about it. Soldiers in the front line can only see and deal with what is immediately in front of them. Those in the serried ranks drawn up behind them had a somewhat better overview of what is happening. They could see the front line buckle, decide that all is lost, and get out of there as quickly as they could. And the people in the front were left to their fate. If it is true that Saint Roux's cavalry rode away with his body as soon as he was killed, it would not be surprising if anyone in the vicinity who saw what was happening would have second thoughts about what they should do as the Williamite cavalry now bore down upon them. But to say such things is to consider them logically with the benefit of hindsight. In the reality of the day, all of these thousands of individuals and local events were taking place among the chaos and noise of the battlefield, with wounded and dying men and horses everywhere, panicked and riderless horses running wild, and the smoke from thousands of muskets overhanging it all. If you've ever seen the amount of smoke that a single shot from a 17th century musket can produce, you can imagine the atmosphere on that hill following hours of repeated firings of thousands of them. It is a natural instinct to blame defeats in war as much as in sport on individuals or individual events. If only our star full forward or out-half hadn't been injured in the first 10 minutes, we might have won the game. If only the referee had seen that outrageous foul and given a penalty, the outcome certainly would have been different. Maybe, and maybe not. Perhaps the cavalry attack by the Williamites at Aughrim Castle was simply too strong for the defenders left there to prevent. However, the blame for the defeat at Aughrim has traditionally been shared by the cannonball which killed Saint Roux and Henry Luttrell, the cavalry commander who was accused of treachery and letting the Williamite cavalry through the pass of the castle. The most surprising thing I found in writing the book was the possibility that Luttrell may not deserve the historical opprobrium attached to his name and may well have been the victim of a sophisticated piece of psychological warfare conducted by the Williamites after Aughrim. Luttrell was an important figure in the Jacobite camp, not because of his military skills, but because he was a close friend, advisor, and confidant of Patrick Sarsfield. Sarsfield, as we all know, was a career soldier, as was Luttrell, and they had fought together in England and in Ireland in several engagements prior to Aughrim. Sarsfield was undoubtedly brave and probably as dashing a figure as he still remains in the popular imagination. He was certainly a good cavalry commander, but he was not so good at politics, either with a small p or a capital P. And as always, there was a lot of politics going on during the Williamite War, especially in the Jacobite camp. After the Battle of the Boyne, Sarsfield was at odds with Richard Talbot, the Earl of Tyrconnell, who was King James's representative in Ireland. Sarsfield wanted to fight on. Talbot considered it was time to do a deal with William of Orange while the Jacobite army remained undefeated, as it had proved to be in the first siege of Limerick in 1690. While Talbot was visiting the exiled king in Paris, Sarsfield tried to wrest power from him by persuading his own friend, the Duke of Berwick, James's eldest illegitimate son, to replace Talbot in his absence. Berwick refused, and their friendship cooled. Incidentally, Berwick later went on to marry Sarsfield's widow. Faced with divisions of opinion between the two dominant figures in his army in Ireland, James dithered and eventually promoted both Sarsfield and Talbot, but put a Frenchman, Saint Roux, in charge of the army for the 1691 campaign. Henry Luttrell was Sarsfield's main advisor in this power struggle and was among a delegation who had gone to Paris over the winter of 1690 and 91 to lobby the king on his behalf and to counter Talbot's case. So Luttrell was a much more important figure in the Jacobite camp than his rank of colonel might suggest. And all of this would probably have been known to the Williamites, Spies and deserters on both sides were always carrying information back and forth. In the immediate aftermath of Aughrim, there is no indication that any suspicion of treachery fell on Luttrell. He went to Limerick with Sarsfield and the majority of the surviving Jacobites, and indeed he led an unsuccessful attempt to break the siege of Galway. He was subsequently sent back towards Galway to escort the Jacobites who had been allowed under the surrender of the city to march fully armed to Limerick. They were accompanied out of the city by a Williamite detachment led by a French Huguenot officer. When the two escorts met to exchange roles on the way to Limerick, Luttrell and the Frenchman had a brief conversation. The Frenchman apparently asked why the Jacobites were still fighting after their devastating defeat at Aughrim. Luttrell replied with a question of his own. Did the Williamite General Ginkell really have the power to agree a treaty on his own, as Ginkell had just done in Galway to the dissatisfaction of some of his own camp, who didn't see any need for a compromise with what they regarded as the now defeated enemy? It was a reasonable question, the kind of question you might expect from someone who had the wider strategies of the campaign in mind. Several weeks later, the French general, now in nominal command of the Jacobite army in Limerick, General D'Usson, received a message from a French Huguenot general in the Williamite army whom he had met during the negotiations at Galway. It said that the next Williamite messenger to the Jacobite camp, they both exchanged messengers regularly, would be carrying a secret communication for Luttrell. By this stage, morale was declining among the Jacobites in Limerick. The defeat at Aughrim had taken a huge toll, both in men and morale. The expected siege of Limerick had not yet begun, but it was only a matter of time. The Williamites were on their way. Desertions were increasing, helped by Williamite offers of amnesties and similar positions in their army to any officer who brought over his men to them. There was talk of more French aid, but no sign of it arriving. France was a long way away. The future was uncertain and pretty bleak. The Williamite messenger duly arrived, was searched, and the message for Luttrell found. It confirmed that Ginkell did indeed have the authority of King William to agree a treaty. The French General D'Usson wanted to hang Luttrell on the spot to discourage other such communications and desertions. Talbot, to whom Luttrell had been a thorn in the side for at least 2 years, wanted him court-martialed and then, presumably, hanged. Sarsfield agreed to the court-martial. Interestingly, the court-martial acquitted Luttrell, although its members were made up of a majority of Talbot supporters. The only account we have of it is a brief one written many years later, which says that nobody could have convicted him on the basis of the evidence available. However, Talbot refused to release him, and Luttrell remained detained in King John's Castle. After Talbot's sudden death from natural causes, Sarsfield, who was now in effective command of the Jacobites, also refused to release his own friend from custody. Luttrell was finally freed after the Treaty of Limerick was signed, and he chose to use its terms to join the Williamite forces. They never took up his offer of bringing his men with him, but gave him a handsome pension instead, which has helped to cement his reputation as a traitor. On the other hand, you could see his decision to change sides as a perfectly understandable response to what he had experienced and the treatment meted out to him by his friend Sarsfield. And you could look on his deal with the Williamites as an example of his negotiating skills which, through the Williamite operation against him, were denied to Sarsfield and the Jacobites when they were negotiating the treaty. Thus, the psychological operation, or PSYOP as we would now call it, by the Williamite command against Luttrell paid very handsome dividends. It succeeded in further demoralizing the Jacobites and depriving their leader Sarsfield of his right-hand man when he was most in need of political and strategic advice. Henry Luttrell may not have been a nice person as depicted in Richard Murphy's epic poem, The Battle of Aughrim. After Limerick, he seized his older brother Simon's estate near Dublin when Simon went to France with Sarsfield, and he later denied it to Simon's widow when she returned to Ireland. He was apparently a notorious womanizer, which was widely presumed at the time to be the motive behind his murder 26 years after Aughrim, when he was shot dead in Dublin on what is now Wolfe Tone Street. The fact that the assassin was never found has left it open as well to speculation that the killer was a survivor of the Battle of Aughrim and shot him in revenge for the events of that day. Not being a nice person, however, does not make one a traitor. And there are other factors to consider which weaken the argument that he was. For instance, there is evidence of considerable cavalry fighting at the castle area of Aughrim from the list of the Williamites' horse casualties. They did counterestimate the number of equine casualties as well as the human ones. And there is the fact that Luttrell was not the commander of the cavalry on that wing of the battlefield. In charge was an English Jacobite general, Dominic Sheldon, who has never, as far as I'm aware, been accused of treachery, perhaps because he was one of those who accompanied Sarsfield to France along with the wild geese. But the most telling point to me is the question of why, if Luttrell was effectively a Williamite agent before or even immediately after Aughrim, why would the Williamites have exposed him and set him up for a probable execution? Surely it would have made more sense for them to keep him as an asset, effectively a spy, at the very top of the Jacobite command, not just in a position to know what was happening, but actually to influence events through his relationship with Sarsfield. There is a strain in Irish history which continues today and extols the man of action, the fighter, over the politician, the negotiator, who by the nature of his occupation must always be willing to compromise at some point or other. Sarsfield was certainly a man of action. Talbot was also one, but a consummate politician as well, the tricky dicky of his day. Perhaps Luttrell was guilty of just being more of a politician than a fighter, and has thus gone down in history as a scapegoat, the fall guy for a defeat, for which he bore no more responsibility than anyone else on that flank of the battlefield at Aughrim. Thank you for listening to this, and if you have any comments or observations, you can contact me through my website, www.joejoyce.ie.